Well, good morning. Welcome to Compass. Our mission is navigating people to God. My name's Nate. I'm the pastor here at Compass North Fort Worth, and we're so glad that you're here. So glad you're worshiping with us. If you're a guest, an extra special welcome to you today. I would love to meet you after the service is over in our Next Steps area, so I hope that you'll stop by on your way out. Well, you know, throughout history, we've seen people who have stood up for what they believed in despite what people around them were saying. For instance, Rosa Parks, she stood up by sitting down on a bus and showing that equality should be for all people, no matter the color of her skin. A year later, the U.S. Senate would pass a law that would say that segregation was banned on public transportation. Or how about in 1862, there was a woman by the name of Susan B. Anthony who would vote in the general election, even though it was illegal for women to vote at that time. And later, a law would be passed, an amendment to the Constitution would be passed because of her actions that would allow women the right to vote in America. Or how about this guy, Jackie Robinson? Jackie Robinson was the first African-American player to break the color barrier in Major League Baseball, and he allowed for other players to pursue their dream as well because of his willingness to stand up. And then there is Sandy Koufax, probably one of the greatest left-handed pitchers of all time in Major League Baseball, who in 1965, Game 1 of the World Series, he declined and refused to pitch in that game because it was the start of Yom Kippur. And for him, as a Jewish man, that holiday for him was so important to him that he wasn't willing to do what he was asked to do for his job. You see, in each of these stories, what we see is people who were willing to stand up for what they believed in, despite what those around them were telling them. And that's the same thing that we see in this Dark Horse story that we want to look at today. You know, over the last 5 weeks, we've been in this series, Dark Horses, and we've been looking at how God used ordinary people to do some extraordinary things. And it's our hope through this series is that you would understand and you would realize that God can use you just like these stories that we've been looking at over the past few weeks. And I think today's story is a story that I hope will inspire you to stand up in a world that is bowing down. Honestly, I think this message is so timely, especially when you think about the culture that we live in today. I mean, all you had to do is turn on the TV or watch the news or scroll through social media, and it seems as though in our culture today, it seems as though morality is kind of spiraling out of control, isn't it? Even as you look at these things that are happening, it may even feel as though that the culture is hopeless, or maybe even you've lost hope. And here's why I think that this series is so critical, and especially this message that we're looking at today, and I'm so excited to share this message today. Here's what I've been praying for each and every single one of you since the beginning of this series. I believe that in this room, there are a bunch of dark horse stories that have yet to be unleashed. And my prayer is that God would raise up a new generation of dark horses here at Compass North Fort Worth that is going to make a huge difference in our families. It's going to make a huge difference in our communities, in our workplaces, in our schools, and even in our world, because we'd be willing to stand up and stand strong in this culture that seems to be compromising. And here, honestly, is another prayer that I've been praying through this series. For some of you here today, maybe you've walked in the church during this series, maybe for the first time, maybe you're new to this whole Christianity thing and Jesus, and you're just trying to figure out, is this something that you want for your life? And my prayer for you is that some of you would make the most important decision that you can ever make at the end of this series next weekend, and you would make a decision to follow Jesus with your life. And so next weekend, as Courtney just shared, is a decision weekend here at Compass North Fort Worth. And at the end of the service today, I'm gonna invite some of you maybe to take that step of faith, to decide that next week is the week you're gonna make that decision to follow Jesus with your life and be baptized. And so there are some towels up on the stage here that I am gonna invite you to come and pick up and say, you know what? I'm making that decision to follow Jesus. I'm standing up, and I'm going to stand strong in a world that is compromising, and that because of that decision to take one of those towels, that next week you would begin your dark horse story with God. Well, today we're going to look at the story of a dark horse by the name of Daniel. If you've got a Bible or a Bible app, you can turn with me to the book of Daniel. And it's in Daniel that we find the story of this guy named Daniel who wasn't willing to bow down when the culture around him told him that that's what he should do. And it's through Daniel's story that I want to answer a question that I think we all struggle with, that we all wrestle with on a regular basis, and that is this: how do you stand out and stand strong in a culture of compromise? Now, just to give you a little bit of background into Daniel's story, Daniel is a teenager when we get to Daniel chapter 1. And Daniel's he's living in Babylon. He's living under Babylonian captivity and oppression. And he's living under this power-hungry, crazy dude who is the king of this time named Nebuchadnezzar. And the reason that Daniel is living in Babylonian captivity is because the Babylonians had defeated the Israelites. And after they defeated them, King Nebuchadnezzar, he decides that he wants to bring back the best and the brightest of the Israelite young men, and he wants to kind of indoctrinate them into the culture. He wants to put them through this training camp of sorts. And so we get to Daniel chapter 1, and this is what it says in verses 3-5 here. It says, "Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men," he said. "Make sure they're well-versed in every branch of learning and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon." The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They were trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Now, basically, what I think King Nebuchadnezzar was trying to do here is he was trying to create his own versions of Jason Bourne. You know what I'm talking about, right? Like if you're a Star Wars fan, basically what he was trying to do is he was trying to create his own clone army. And what he was trying to do, he was changing the way they thought, changing the way that they acted, changing the way that they lived, changing their clothing style, maybe even their hairstyles, even changing things down to the foods that they ate. And honestly, when you think about it, it's kind of like our culture is trying to do to us today as followers of Christ, isn't it? They're trying to change who we are. That's what the enemy wants to do. That's what Satan is trying to do. He's trying to make us think and conform to the patterns of this world or to his patterns rather than these godly patterns, which is why I think we've got to be willing to stand out and stand strong in a world that's bowing down. And it's through Daniel's story that I think we can learn some great things about how do we stand up to a culture of compromise around us. And so look at what it says next in verses 6 and 7 here in chapter 1. It says, "Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belteshazzar, Hananiah was called Shadrach, Mishael was called Meshach, and Azariah was called Abednego." And so here is where we really get introduced to Daniel along with his 3 friends. And notice what happens as soon as they're kind of taken into this Babylonian culture. It says that Nebuchadnezzar's chief of staff immediately begins to change and rename these guys. The goal was not just to indoctrinate them into the culture, but it was also, their goal was to change their identities as well. And so these guys get new names. Daniel, his name originally would have meant God is my judge, but he gets a new name that's Belteshazzar, which equals lady protect the king. And so he's given this girl's name. And then his 3 friends, Hananiah, his name was Yahweh has been gracious to me. That's what it meant, but it gets changed to Shadrach, which meant I am fearful of God. And then Mishael, his name would have meant who is what God is. But his name gets changed to Meshach, which means I am despised and shameful before God. And then there's Azariah, and his name meant Yahweh has helped me. But his name gets changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. So he's given this name of a Babylonian god. And do you see what has happened here in this moment? You see, all of their original names were tied to the worship of God and God's love for them. But Nebuchadnezzar and his royal officials, who are these pagan worshiping, God worshiping people, they're like, no, we got to change that. And so what do they decide to do? They decide to change their names to the names of these pagan gods. You see, they were trying to change these guys' identities. They were trying to get these guys to mold into their culture that they were living in. And what we see throughout Daniel's story is that Daniel and his three friends, they continued to remember who God said that they were despite what the culture around them was saying. And I think this is the key for us as we strive to stand up and stand strong when the world around us is bowing down. What we have to remember is this: you must remember who God says that you are. You know, for some, maybe here today, you've been told that you're not beautiful, or that you're not, that you're ugly, or that maybe you're not handsome, and you've allowed those thoughts that have been said about you to control your mindset. And so you've gone to things like putting filters on your photos so that you can make yourself look more acceptable to culture. But I think if God were standing here today, he would tell you this. You say, don't listen to the words of anyone else. You're the most beautiful person in the world. I created you just the way that you are. Don't let the world tell you how you should look. Don't let the world give you this vision or this perception of who you should be. Just know that I think that you are beautiful. For some of you, maybe you've been told that you're a failure or that you don't have what it takes. If God were standing here today, he would tell you this: you're not a failure. That in me, you're more than a conqueror. Just put your faith and your trust in me, and I'll be right there beside you. Maybe for someone here today, you were told by someone that you love that they don't love you anymore. They said they don't want to be with you anymore, and they didn't have that love or the desire for you or a relationship anymore, and you've been made to feel as though you cannot be loved or that you will never encounter love anymore. And God, if he were standing here today, he would say, don't allow those words to be the words that you hear, because I love you so much. Maybe for some of you, you've been led to believe that your value is in the number of followers that you have on social media, or it's the number of friends that you have in your inner circle. And when you begin to compare yourself to other people, you don't feel that valuable. If God were standing here today, he would say these words to you: you are valuable. You are more valuable than you will ever know. You are so valuable to me that I was willing to send my son to this earth for you, because I love you and I care about you. And you see, what we have to remember is when the voices tell me that I'm not good enough, God says that I am. See, despite the name changes that Daniel and his three friends received, we see that they didn't forget who God says that they were, and neither should we. That's the first thing that we see about Daniel. The second thing that we see about Daniel from his story that I think is important for us to remember as we stand up in a world that is bowing down is that Daniel was a guy who resolved not to compromise ahead of time. Look at what it says in verse 8 here. Remember, the king wanted to change everything about Daniel and his friends, even down to the way that they ate. But this is what it says in verse 8. It says, but Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating food and the wine given to them by the king. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. You see, for Daniel and his friends, this decision not to eat this food and wine that was given to them was because of who they knew who they were. They were remembering who God said that they were. These guys were Jews. And they had certain foods that they didn't eat, and there were certain meats that they would not eat because the meat had to be drained a proper way. And Daniel, as he saw the food brought into this room, I imagine on this day, he sees this food brought in, and he knows that the food hasn't been prepared the way that it should for them, and that the meat hasn't been drained properly, and it's probably been offered up to these pagan gods as well. And so Daniel, as it's set down in front of him, he kind of speaks up. He's like, hey, man, thanks for like trying to feed us really well, man. I can't even believe that the king would bring food out of his royal pantry. I mean, this is amazing. And let me tell you, like, that candied bacon looks amazing. And those maple bacon donuts, man, I've always wanted to try them. But in my family, you see, we just don't eat pork. And so I was kind of wondering, like, could we try to eat something else instead? Is there anything else that maybe the chef could whip up for us? And look at what it says next in verses 9 to 12. It says, now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. So Daniel, he's found favor with the chief of staff, and I believe the reason that he's found favor with the chief of staff is because he had favor with God. because Daniel had resolved ahead of time not to compromise. But then it goes on to say this. He responded, am I afraid of my, but he responded, and this is the servant saying this, I am afraid of my Lord the king, who has ordered that you eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. At the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food, and then make your decision in light of what you see. Now, there's three things that Daniel does here in this moment where he could have easily compromised, but three things that he does that I want to show you that show us the kind of person that we need to be. And there's 3 C's I want to give you. The first thing that we see about Daniel is this, is that Daniel, he was a man of conviction. Verse 8 says that Daniel was determined not to compromise ahead of time. And look, for all of us here today, if we don't hold to our convictions, what can easily happen is we can begin to compromise right away. All it takes is a thought like, you know what? I'll just go to the party this one time. I'll just have one drink so I can fit in with everyone else. But what happens is we think, you know what? I got to go back a second time, and one drink turns to 2 drinks. The next time it turns to more, and before you know it, we have this problem that we can't get a hold of. Or maybe it's thinking like this, you know what? I'll just fudge the numbers on the spreadsheet this one time just so that I look good in front of my boss, because I just really don't want to hear it from him this month, but I'll never do it again. Or it's something like this, you know what? I'll just click on the link this one time, but I promise that I'll never look at those things again. But you see, if we don't hold firm to our convictions, we will let compromise begin to set in our lives. And that's what we see about Daniel. The first thing is that he did not compromise because he was a man of conviction. The second thing that we see about Daniel is that Daniel was a man of cooperation. Like, when faced with having to eat this food that he knew he couldn't eat, he's not like a little kid who throws a temper tantrum and he's like, fine, I'm not eating that. Nah, he doesn't do that. Like instead, he just says, hey, I was kind of wondering, like, is there anything else that we can eat? Like something different that we could eat that's maybe not a pork product. And so he's a man of conviction. He's also a man who was willing to cooperate in the midst of it, because he realized that this guy's head was on the line if Daniel and his friends didn't look a certain way, which leads to the third thing, I think, when it comes to standing up in a culture of compromise, and that is this, is that Daniel, he was a man of courage. Daniel makes this request. He's like, hey, what if for the next 10 days, what if you simply just feed us vegetables and water and see how we are at the end of those 10 days? And if we're not weaker, if we don't look more pale than the rest of us, you allow us to keep eating those things. But if we look different, if we're not as strong as the other guys, then you can make us eat this food that everybody else is eating. And you see, what Daniel did here is he did something that nobody else was willing to do. He stood up when everybody else was bowing down. Let me ask you this. Are you willing to stand up for courage for what it is that you believe in? You see, a few weeks ago, I was in Phoenix, Arizona with some pastors from across the country, and I've been doing this communicators cohort with some guys and gals, and we were in this living room of a pastor that I highly respected. And he was kind of leaning into us and giving us some wisdom and things. And he had been at this huge church. And if I named the church, some of you would know exactly what church he was at. But he was in this huge church, and he had to stand up with courage for what he believed in, despite what the leadership in the church was saying they didn't want to do. And they were just trying to cover things up and sweep things under the rug. And as I listened to his story, I was so encouraged by his boldness to do the right thing, even though it ended up costing him so much. And you know, as I listened to his story, I thought to myself this: what if more people were willing to stand up with courage in a world that's bowing down? Can you imagine what our world might be like right now if we were willing to have courage like Daniel? And you see, in this world of compromise, in this world that is bowing down, we need to be like Daniel and be courageous without compromise. At the end of these 10 days, after Daniel and his buddies have been just eating these vegetables and drinking water, listen to what it says here in verse 15. It says, at the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends, they looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. See, Daniel had this courage, and he would not bend to what the culture was saying. He would not compromise, and notice what God does for him. We see that God takes care of Daniel and his friends. They looked healthier and they were more well-fed than these other guys. And then it goes on to say this in verses 18 to 20. It says, when the training period ordered by the king was completed, the chief of staff, he brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Whenever the king consulted them in any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians, the enchanters in his entire kingdom. And I love what it says there. It says, no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they enter the royal service. You see, because of their willingness to stand for what they believed in, I believe that God rewards them for their faithfulness to him. In fact, these guys, they impressed King Nebuchadnezzar so much that when it came to asking for wisdom in the decisions for this kingdom, you know who this unbelieving king went to? He went to Daniel and his 3 friends and he said, guys, I need wisdom. Like these enchanters and these magicians, these guys are not smart enough. I need wisdom from you guys. And so at the end of chapter 1, we get to chapter 1, it says this about Daniel. It says, Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. Now, if you go back and you look at the history books, what you find is that reign of King Nebuchadnezzar will last 70 years before King Cyrus comes into power. So Daniel is in this position of power for 70 years. But his dark horse story doesn't end there. In fact, it's just getting started. We're going to fast forward to chapter 6, and we find Daniel again with his faith being challenged. And there are a couple other things that I think we see in Daniel's story that help us to stand strong in a world that is bowing down. And as we get to chapter 6, what we find is that Daniel, there's a new king that comes into power. After King Cyrus, there's a king by the name of King Darius who comes into power. And King Darius makes this decision that he's going to divide the kingdom of Babylon up into 3 kind of quadrants. And so he selects Daniel and he selects these 2 other guys that he thinks are going to be the guys that are going to be put in charge. And so we get to Daniel chapter 6. And in verse 3, it tells us this, though, about Daniel. It says, Daniel soon proved himself more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. So basically what happens here is Daniel one-ups the rest of the guys. He shows these other guys up and he's like the king's like, man, I made a mistake here. Like, I don't need to divide the kingdom up. I need to put Daniel in charge of the entire kingdom. But these other guys, they get wind of this and they think they're deserving of this role, and they're kind of ticked that Daniel has just pulled the rug out from underneath them because he's one-upped them. And so now, like, they're trying to go after Daniel. And just like we saw in Nehemiah's story in chapter 1, we're about to see the same thing in Daniel's story, and I believe you will see those things in your own dark horse story when you stand up and you do what God has called you to, that sometimes you can expect to be torn down when you courageously stand out. And here's why I say that. Look at what it says in verse 4. It says, then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way that Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, completely trustworthy. I mean, these guys, they run him through every database that they can. They hire private inspectors, like they get the Babylonian federal agencies involved. But there's nothing on Daniel's record that they can use against him. It is spotless. And I believe the reason is because of what it says there in verse 4. It says that he was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. I mean, these dudes are trying to run Daniel's name through the mud, but there is nothing that is on his record that they can use against him. So now it's like, what are we going to do? How are we going to bring Daniel down? You know what they decide to do? They decide that they will use Daniel's faithfulness against him. And verse 5 says this, so they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. See, they knew that Daniel was a man who did not compromise his religious beliefs. And so they decide that's the way that they're going to bring him down. And so these guys, they go to King Darius one day and they boost his ego a little bit. And they're like, mighty king, we come to you today. We are so thankful to be under your service. And what we would love is, we would love for you to make this decree that everyone pray and bow to you because you are so almighty and holy. And we think that you should declare this. And I don't know why they sounded English because they're Hebrew, right? But that's what they sound like in my head, right? And the king is like, man, that is a great idea, bro. Man, I love that. Hey, get those lawmakers in here like right now, ASAP. Let's make this law happen right now. And so the king has this law written up that for the next 30 days that you can only pray to him. If you pray to someone else, you get thrown into the lion's den. And he signs it into order. But the problem is like Daniel's not there at this moment. And they did it when they knew that Daniel wasn't going to be there. But look at what it says here in verse 10. It says, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, and he went home and he knelt down as usual in his upstairs room. With his windows open towards Jerusalem, he prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. See, Daniel's response is to do what he'd always done. He goes home. He goes up to his upstairs room and he opens the windows facing towards Jerusalem. He gets down on his knees and he begins to pray. And I love what it says there in that verse. There's 2 words that stand out to me. Those 2 words are these words, as usual. Daniel did what Daniel always did. This isn't Daniel like going, fine, you want to make that law? I'll show you. Like, no, this is just Daniel doing what Daniel had always done. This is what he did every single day. And what I love even more is despite this law that had just been signed into place and Daniel knowing what that meant for him, Daniel just got down on his knees and he started praying to God. And notice what it says there. And all the while he was giving thanks to his God. Here's the last thing I think we learn from Daniel's story when it comes to standing up in a world that is bowing down. And that is this, that kneeling to pray is what gives you the strength to stand. And verse 11 says this, then the officials went together to Daniel's house and they found him praying and asking for God's help. You see, like Daniel, what we have to understand is that when we stand up and we stand strong for God, that there will come those moments where we might get attacked by others, that others will try to bring us down. And we have to understand that in this world, it's not promised that being a follower of Christ makes it any easier. In fact, Jesus even said these words. He says, in this world, you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world. It is not a guarantee that when we follow Jesus with our lives, that this world will be easy and things will be easy and we'll just get to heaven and things will be great. No, there will be these moments as we follow God in our life, as we live out these dark horse stories, that the best thing that we can do is to get on our knees and cry out to God for help and say, God, I need your help right now in this moment. I don't know what else to do. God, I need you to be with me. And here's what I think we have to understand about prayer. Prayer today is preparation for whatever comes our way tomorrow. Prayer helps us prepare for the good and the bad that we will experience here on this earth. That's why at the beginning of this series, we kicked it off by doing a 21 days of prayer challenge together. And we just kind of wrapped that up and culminated that with a night of worship the other night at the garage, which was amazing. And the reason that we wanted to do that is because we believe that prayer is the thing that allows us to focus on who God is. It allows us to fix our eyes on who God is and allows us to see what God wants us to see. It allows God to speak into us in those moments when we're really not sure what to do. And that's what Daniel does in this moment because he knows what's about to happen to him. That day as Daniel's down on his knees and he's praying to God, those guys that were trying to trap Daniel, they come to his house because they knew that's where Daniel would be. And they get up there and they come up to the second floor, and I'm sure they pulled out their iPhone X and they're FaceTiming with King Darius. You're not gonna believe what Daniel's doing. And as King Darius is watching this, he's like, is that Daniel? Like, really? Like Daniel? I mean, does it have to be Daniel? I love Daniel, and I'm putting Daniel in charge of this whole thing. If it was somebody else, it would be better, but really, Daniel? So the king's like, bring him back. And so they bring him back into the palace, and the king's like, Daniel, were you really praying to your God and not to me? And Daniel's like, yeah, I was, because I'm not gonna bow down to a king that's an earthly king. I have a heavenly king that I serve. And the king's like, Daniel, I don't wanna have to do this, but I signed this law into order. And because of this, I gotta throw you in the den. But I'm hoping that your God, who you're praying to, can save you. And this is what he says to him in verse 16. He says, may your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. Darius didn't wanna do this, but he's left with no other choice. And so that night, as Daniel gets thrown into the lion's den, Darius, he can't sleep. He's tossing and turning. He tries to binge watch his favorite Netflix TV show. It's not working. And so it says that he just fasts all night long. And as soon as the morning comes, it says that Darius runs to the lion's den where Daniel is at, and then he goes to this hole and he looks down in it, and it's still kind of like the sun's coming up, so it's hard to see down in the pit. And so he yells down in, Daniel, you down there? It's kind of quiet for a minute. And Daniel, he's kind of groggy. He's been having a good night's sleep. So he finally stirs because he hears the king's voice. He's like, yeah, what is it, king? He's like, Daniel, you're alive? He's like, yeah, you wouldn't believe it, king. Actually, it's the best night's sleep I ever had, better than a Holiday Inn Express. And man, those lion pillows, those are the most comfortable pillows I've ever slept on. I gotta get some for my house. Okay, that's not what it actually says in the Bible, but that's my translation. This is what he actually says. He says, my God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. And then it goes on to say this in verse 23. The king was overjoyed, and he ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Daniel says, my God sent his angels to shut the mouths of lions, and because of that, God spared him. And so King Darius, he hears this, he's like, get Daniel out of the pit now. And so they pull Daniel out. And immediately the king's like, you know what? Where's that bill that I signed into order that people should pray to me? No, we're ripping that up right now. You know what? I'm making a new decree. You're gonna pray to Daniel's God, because Daniel's God just rescued him from the pit of the lions. And this is what it says in verses 26 and 27. He says, I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of lions, and that same God that rescued Daniel is the same God that will do the same for you, as long as you will declare that with your life. And you see, here's what I believe. I believe, like Daniel, that God has placed you where you are right now for this very moment to impact the lives of other people. And you might be like, I don't know why, God, you've put me in this workplace. Like it doesn't seem like God is anywhere in the midst of this place. God placed you there for a reason, I believe. Like students, you might be in your school for a reason because you're supposed to be a difference maker. You're supposed to change the culture in your school. And you're like, I don't see God much in the school, but maybe God placed you there so that you could be the change maker. And maybe it's in your own family. That you didn't grow up in a family that knows God or loves God. Maybe you're the one who's to change or shift the culture in your family because you're the one who will take that step of faith to follow Jesus with your life and be the first one to make that decision for him. I believe that God has placed you right where you're at for such a time as this. He's calling you to stand out and stand strong, even when the world around you is bowing down. You know, that pastor friend that I shared about a little bit earlier, on the second day as we were getting ready to leave, he was like, hey, before you leave, I want to give you all a gift. And so he went back to his office and he came back a few minutes later, and he came back and he had these little bags for us. And in these bags was this little key necklace. And he handed one to each of us, and the necklace on it, he had stamped 2 words. And those 2 words that he had stamped were these words: Rak Shishak. Those 2 words are actually Hebrew words that Hebrew warriors would chant as they marched into battle. And as I think about what that must have been like as they marched into battle, they probably marched in unison just like an army would do. And they just said these words over and over again: Rak Shishak, Rak Shishak, Rak Shishak. And they said it over and over again. And what they were saying when they said those words is this: all strength and courage to the glory of God. And as he handed those necklaces to us, he said, you know, my prayer for you is that you would have strength and courage for whatever it is that God has called you to as a pastor. And I listened to that and I thought, man, that's such a good illustration. I got to find some place to use that. And then I was writing this message and I'm like, I know right where I'm going to use it. Because my prayer for each and every one of you is that you too would have a little Rak Shishak as you go into your daily lives and you go to where God is calling you to go, that you would have strength and courage to the glory of God, that maybe for some of you, you would have strength and courage for that thing that breaks your heart that we talked about in week 1, that you would have strength and courage when you have those moments of feeling inadequacy in your life, that you would have strength and courage when you make excuses for maybe what God is calling you to, that you would have strength and courage to whatever it is that you wrote on one of these I commit cards last week that scares you half to death. So as we close today, let me just give you those words one more time as a challenge to just be strong and courageous. Rak Shishak. That's my prayer for you. Because I believe there are a whole bunch of dark horse stories that have yet to be told in this room. And all we have to do is say, God, just use me. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to just stand with me right now as we close out. And as I send you out today, one of the things that I wanted to do is I wanted to send you out ready for battle, ready to prepare and prepared for whatever might come your way. And so on the count of 3, when I tell you, I'm going to have you chant those 2 words, Rak Shishak, with me 3 times, okay? Because we're marching into battle together. We are not doing this alone. And may this be our battle cry today. So on the count of 3, chant with me those words. 1, 2, 3. Rak Shishak. Rak Shishak, Rak Shishak, Rak Shishak. Would you pray with me? Father, I pray for strength and courage for each and every person in this room for whatever it is that you are calling them to, God. God, I pray that you would give them the courage that they need to face the battles that they will face today and every day. God, I pray that you would help them to stand with conviction and not be ones to compromise in a world that is bowing down around them. God, give them strength and courage for whatever comes their way. God, I pray for some here today that they would have the courage to take a step of faith, to come to the front here in just a minute and grab one of these towels and say, you know what, I am going to make Jesus Lord and Savior of my life, and I'm going to get baptized next week. I'm praying for 20 seconds of insane courage for some people here today. I'm praying for courage in workplaces. I'm praying for courage in families. I'm praying for courage in marriages. I'm praying for courage for students at school. I'm praying for courage wherever we go. God, wherever we step foot and whatever ground we step foot on, God, that you would give us the courage to be strong and courageous for you. So God, I just lift it all up to you right now, and we pray these things in your name. Amen.